Hi, it's Richard Dunn at Evoker. In this video we're going to do a brief introduction to Cascade. This is UDK's particle editor, and when used in conjunction with UDK's material editor it is a very powerful piece of equipment. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go through these one tab at a time, and I'm just going to explain what the different things do, the main things we're going to use. Some of these things we'll use as we go through these lessons, so I won't do too much on those ones until we need to use them. So if we look along the top here, we have Edit. This is just the standard button for saving your package rather than going into your content browser and doing it. View is just basically giving you different statistics that you can view, like your particle counts, anything else like that. It's more advanced stuff for people who are optimizing their particle effects. If you look there, we have view memory. It's just telling you what it's using. View geometry. That's basically so we can load in a mesh. If we're wanting to see how the particle interacts with a mesh in the scene, we are going to do this by loading this torch in when we get started. View geometry properties are the properties of these meshes that we can load in. So we can load in any mesh from the content browser, as well as any materials for it, etc. When we come down to here, we have detail mode. This is just the quality of the rendering in the preview window. Best to leave this at high all the time. Window is just basically telling you whether you've got all these windows open in the editor, so by default these should all be ticked. I'd recommend that you leave these ticked. When we drop down to this next line, we have Restart Sim. Basically what that does is restarts the simulation of the particle inside the preview window in here. So if it stops or you start running low on memory or anything like that, you can just hit this blue one. Now the orange one, if you've got instances of your particle already in the level and the same thing happens, this will restart the simulation in your level. The little magnifying glass is the same as the one that you find in all your properties in any tab inside the Unreal Engine. It's the same as this little one here, and it's the same as this little one here. Basically it's finding the selected object in the content browser. Right here is a handy little button. This enables us to take a shot of the particle in here and actually put it against our model in the content browser. So instead of seeing a particle system that just looks black with no picture, we can create an image of that particle effect just by setting up your particle effect how you want it and pressing this button. It will automatically load. This little button here enables the camera to orbit around the model. The next one, toggle motion. If you have any motion modules on the particle effect, this will enable their animation in the viewport. We're not going to be needing that in this series of lessons, but that's what it does. This changes our view mode, so we can look at the particle rendered. We can look at its components and its overdraw. There we're looking at its lighting. There we're looking at the wireframe, and back to lit. Toggle bounds is just basically rendering the size or the bounds of the object. We don't need to worry about this. Toggle post-processing just turns on and off any post-processing that you might have assigned to the scene. Again, we're not going to be using that in these series of videos. One that we may use is the grid. If you find you need to orient yourself and you're not sure which way is up and which way is down, you can always flip the grid on to see what you're doing. Keep in mind, of course, that Z should always be up. Otherwise, you could be looking at it like that, which is upside down. This little button obviously is self-explanatory. Play, pause. Now we also have a very neat little feature here which becomes quite useful. We can slow down the playback speed of any particle just by clicking we can go right down to 1%. So we can go down 50, 25, 10, 1. This is particularly handy if you're trying to look at fast movement of particles. The next button is the loop system. Basically, this just tells the preview window to play this constantly. Real time is pretty much the same as play or pause. Background color is self-explanatory. It's basically this black. Sometimes if you're doing a particle effect that is black, you can't see it against the black background. So we can come in here and we can change the background color like so. But black is best for most things. Next we have undo and redo, just like any other piece of software. The rest of these buttons from here on relate to LOD. They are there to manage lower versions or smaller versions of these effects, less complex versions that can be swapped out and rendered further away from the camera, just like any other asset in a game. Just about everything has an LOD level assigned to it. The only exception is this here, which is the change detail mode, which is the same as this here. So now we're going to move down into the preview window. Movement in here is left mouse click and drag. Scale is right mouse and up and down with the mouse. And panning is just middle mouse dragging. Now the main place where these particles are created is in this window here. We can create a new particle system by just right clicking and going new particle sprite emitter. Modules are added as you need them by right clicking and adding any of these modules that you see fit. Down here we have the properties of the module that is selected. So whatever you have selected here is what's going to show up in here. We're going to get deeply into this later on, so there's not too much point in getting into that now. The other thing that we should cover here in the introduction is the graph editor. Sometimes values can be entered in through numerics in the properties. Sometimes it's easier to do the same thing through the graph. Everything that's in the graph lives in here as numbers. These are basically just two ways of looking at the same thing. But in this example, what we're going to look at is the smoke. And in this module, we have color over life. As you can see here, we have the RGB, but we've turned those off. This is why this button is grayed out. This button on the end, this little square, is saying whether or not this is active. If we turn it on, you can see we have these lines which are associated with color over life. If we turn that one off, you can see we have nothing. We can also disable these channels simply by clicking them. So if we wanted to look at color over life and not alpha over life, we could turn that on. If we wanted to fit this to the viewport, we use these arrows to fit horizontally and to fit vertically. Now if we wanted to just work on the red graph, we can turn those off. It's just a switch. But in this example, we actually want to be looking at alpha over life. And we're just going to fit that to the viewport. Now to move any of these points, we want to have this button selected. We click the point and we control left click and we can move it around in the viewport. We have a number of different tangency settings to change the way the curves come in. We can also change those tangencies by dragging on the handle. If we come down here, you see we're changing the curve of that coming into the graph. This is something you'll see a lot of in animation. The last thing that I want to go through with this curve editor is how you can set these values numerically rather than just guessing in the grid. Here we have a point that should be at 0.1, but because we've moved it, we've lost the value. So we can right click, make that active. Let's move it down so it's at a random number. Now we can right click and we can set the time, which is along the bottom here. The horizontal numbers are time. So if we wanted to set the time to say 0.5, you'll see this move over to this line, like so. That's not what we want in this case, so I'll put it back. We'll go 0.3. And as you can see now, if we zoom in, our point is just under the 0.1 that we want. So if we come back and we right click, we can go set value. As you can see, it's at 0.097034. So if we just go 0.1, that point is now at 0.3 in time and 0.1 in amount. So that's really all there is to the particle editor. It's just lots of different modules. Now getting back to modules, if you've got curves assigned to a module such as this and you don't want them there anymore, you need to right click. Now you can remove just that curve, and I'll Control Z to undo that. Or you can right click and remove all curves. It will ask if you're sure. Yes. All that's doing is removing them from the preview window. It's not removing them from the particle. You can also disable these modules simply by clicking on these little ticks here. That's basically turning off the effect. Just like here, you can turn off this entire particle by clicking on the checkbox. As you can see, the smoke's disappeared. If you want to look at everything and just look at the smoke and turn everything else off, rather than going through and unticking all three, you can just click this. That is basically doing the reverse of unticking all these ones. It's just a quicker way. Basically, think of the S as solo mode. So when you click S, you're only looking at that module. And lastly is this little squiggly line here. This brings us back to what we had here with the curves. If we want to look at something's curves, we say we want to look at color over lights curves, we click that, and there they are. And again, if we want to get rid of both of them, remove all curves, like so. So once you get comfortable with all that, spend some time, play around with it, then we're ready to start actually creating our first particle effect.